Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, ISB Assistive Technology Guidance Document FAQ Follow-Up Webinar. We are very excited to have Gail Bowser and Amy Deegan here, both to complete the last follow-up webinar addressing the FAQ document relative to the Illinois Assistive Technology Manual. I'm very happy to welcome back Gail Bowser and Amy Deegan, and I'm going to pass the screen controls over to them at this time so they can get started.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to our final webinar in this webinar series, and one that's related to a whole webinar series that we also did last year. So I am pleased to be back with you one more time in order to kind of review what we've done over the past set of webinars about the Illinois AT Guidance Manual, and also about the Frequently Asked Questions document, which was issued this year by ISPE. And I'm Gail Bowser. I work as an independent consultant and under contract with Infinitec. I got to be the primary author on the second edition of the Illinois Guidance Manual and also on the Frequently Asked Questions document. Amy Deegan is also here with us from ISBE. Amy, say hello to everybody.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. As both Gail and Sam said, I am the principal consultant for low incidence populations over at the Illinois State Board of Education, and I also oversee the assistive technology grants. So thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you here, Amy. We really value having your knowledge and your breadth of experience, especially with assistive technology. I wanted to give you a quick history of what it is we're actually coming to close with today. We began the Illinois AT Guidance Manual. The first edition was written in 2012 by Dr. Brian Wojcik. And then in 2018, he began a series of focus groups for developing the second edition of the manual. And his questions were what was in the manual that was needed to be updated, were there things that were unclear, and also what had not been included that maybe needed to be included. So in 2019, we began revision work on the actual writing of the guide, and Dr. Wojcik moved to Nebraska. I was actually in a meeting with him this morning where he's working for the Nebraska Tech Act right now. So he wasn't able to finish the second edition. So that's when I got to join the state of Illinois in getting this second edition developed. We took a lot of questions from the field after the second edition was published, and in 2021, earlier this year, we developed the Frequently Asked Questions document. This is the cover of the second edition of the Illinois AT Guidance Manual. And these are the table of contents that are in that manual. One of the things I want to say about this guide is that it was really written as a good, solid reference guide. Every chapter, you can see all the different topics in the different chapters here, but every chapter is really pretty much written with a question and answer format, because we recognize that there were many, many questions from the field about assistive technology and assistive technology processes. So every chapter was written with a question and answer format. If you want to download the guide itself, it's available in multiple formats, including Braille and accessible text and enlarged text and all kinds of formats at this web address. And Sam, if you don't mind, if you can put that web address in the chat or in wherever you think. Oh, no, wait, the manual is in our handouts today, so we don't need to do that, but it's also available on the web if you want to share it with other people that you work with. As we mentioned in 2021 in January, we completed a frequently asked questions document that's designed to accompany the guidance manual. For the most part, these questions are addressed in the AT guidance manual, but sometimes we felt like we needed a further clarification. And so this document also is on the ISBE website and has been vetted by the Bureau. You also have this document as a handout today in the handout section of the webinar. This is the list of frequently asked questions sections in the frequently asked questions document. And we have, in our previous webinars this year, we've covered all of these different sections and tried to focus on the things that were of most concern or the most confusing to people. So these are the kinds of questions that you will find in the frequently asked questions document, again, in a question and answer format, which we hope will help you to use it as a reference tool when you come to a specific situation. For today's webinar, what we're going to do is we're going to review some of the things that came up in almost every one of the webinars we did about both the guidance manual and the frequently asked questions document. So we want to go back and take a look at some of those things that still seem to cause a little bit of confusion among practitioners in the field and see if we can offer any clarification. We're also going to take a closer look at some of the appendices and resource documents because we haven't had a chance to do that in our webinar series. And then finally, a group of AT specialists that work with Infinitec were kind enough to develop some scenarios, some stories about some of the situations that they have encountered as they've addressed this issue of how do we do effective, ethical, and legal assistive technology services in Illinois. And we're going to use those scenarios to kind of demonstrate how you can use the guidance manual and see if there are additional questions that you might have about those. Anytime you want, please feel free to enter your questions and concerns in the questions panel. Sometimes we find that there are questions that we need to go back to the Bureau and check with, although we've got Amy here today, so that's less likely. But if we can't answer the questions today, we will follow up with you at a future time. One other thing that's important to note is that both these documents are provided as supports to district in order to clarify procedural questions and describe effective practices. But sometimes your district has systems in place that are working beautifully and do provide FAPE, free and appropriate public education, for the students in your district. If you're working in a system like that, where you have good, effective, and ethical and legal systems in place, and your students are receiving assistive technology services if they need them and in the least restrictive environment, this is not an indication that you need to change your practices. Sometimes you may actually have to go to your district attorney if you get into situations that are really complicated and aren't covered by the information in the guide or the frequently asked questions document, and if your systems aren't working to support some of your students. It's also important to say that any state level guide, in this case the ISB Assistive Technology Guide and Frequently Asked Questions documents, provide general guidance about assistive technology as it's addressed in IDEA and Illinois rules. But sometimes the decisions about how to implement this guidance is very specific to your students and your districts. And in those situations, it's not possible for the state to answer those very specific questions. So here's some examples of the kinds of questions that you probably will not find answers to if you review the guide that we're talking about today. So questions like, what are specific sources of funding for AT devices and services? You may have a budget line in your district, or you may have some other source of funding in your district, but the state does not tell school districts how to allocate their own resources, at least not to that level of specificity. So other questions, how do individual IEP teams complete evaluation planning? That's often a district process, and it will apply to not only assistive technology questions, but also to other questions about how your district does things. What are the timelines as they apply to individual student? That's going to depend on the situation. Questions about actions the student team should take when parents make specific requests. And how does our agency develop and manage 504 plans? So these are things we're going to touch on in our examples today, but it's important to know that the way your district does things will vary from district to district, depending on your resources, the number of students in your district, your geographic area. I know that many districts in the southern part of the state are much more rural than in the Metro Chicago area, and so the way you do things will be very different. One place to look for guidance about how your district might do things related to assistive technology is in chapter 10 of the guide itself. The final chapter in the AT guidance manual is really designed to help districts think about how they will provide effective AT services for all of their students who might be eligible or who might need assistive technology. If you're really thinking about that as an agency, or if you're thinking about starting an assistive technology team in your district, or if you're just not sure how you should be handling things with your agency, these are topics: leadership and vision, management, supervision and professional development, and proactive planning, that are included in the guide and talk not about individual students, but how school districts might actually address the formation of a more coordinated and organized assistive technology program. So I put a note there that page 48 is where you can find that chapter in the guide. This is an area where I've done a great deal of work in my professional career, and I'm always happy to talk to teams about how they might be working. And I know Amy has said that to me too, that she loves to be support to assistive technology teams throughout the state. So do contact us. Our contact information is at the end of this PowerPoint, and so you should have that in your handouts. Here's an example of one of the questions that might be addressed at that district-wide level. And I just wanted to show it to you because as we're talking about customizing services in two different districts, this is a good example of how different places do things differently. So the question is, what are the sources of funding for AT for students who need specialized, high-cost, and complicated AT systems like Braille note takers or eye-gaze computer input systems? It's a question that many teams, particularly teams that work with students with significant and complicated disabilities, may be asking. And it's an important question to ask because it does fall upon the IEP team to make a decision about whether students need those kind of devices. We know that most assistive technology is not particularly high cost, and these days most assistive technology solutions are included in the operating systems and the apps that go with the technology that most of our kids are using, but every once in a while there's a need for a high-cost system. Here's two different answers from two different districts. In District 1, the more inexpensive things like talking calculators, pencil grips, and other low-tech devices are purchased using the school budget. In this example, there's a district-wide budget line that pays for any needed AT purchase that costs more than $200. So that's just how that particular school district has addressed assistive technology purchases that are over, and their number was $200. It could be any number, and that all depends again on district resources. In our second example district, items that cost less than $50 are purchased using the special education classroom budget. So most special education classrooms get a budget allocation every year. You can spend up to, I'm not even going to say a number because somebody will tell me it's too high or too low, but most special education classrooms have a budget for small expenses. But all other assistive technology costs in this district are covered under the special education program budget, and they have a budget line that says assistive technology. So any special education program budget item must be submitted to the Office of the Director of Special Education. So there's two different ways of handling it. The numbers are going to be different, things like that. So when you start to ask specific questions about the way your district's doing things, one of the things that I really suggest is that you ask your Director of Special Education how your district does specific things and how the rules that are used for all students with disabilities do apply to assistive technology. They may not have an answer for you, but they probably will want to help you explore the answers. And one of the ways to explore the answers is to look at the Illinois AT Guidance Manual. So our focus today, as I said, we pulled out items that we saw asked over and over again, where there still seemed, even at our last webinar, to be some confusion or some concern. And so these are the three things that we're really going to focus today on in the AT Guidance Manual. We're going to talk about the state statute and the rules about consideration. We're going to make a distinction between consideration, assessment, and evaluation. We're going to talk about domains one more time, and then we're going to hopefully have time to take a look at the appendices in the guide, because there's some really good resources there, and we want to just call your attention to them as we move forward. So state statutes. This is Public Act 100-0993, Senate Bill 0454, enacted in August of 2018. And the wording in this language is very clearly designed to help make sure that parents understand the role that assistive technology plays in their child's educational program. So at the child's initial IEP meeting and at each annual review meeting, the team shall provide the parent or guardian with a written notification that informs the parent or guardian that the IEP team is required to consider assistive technology in order for the child to receive a free and appropriate public education. The notification must also include a toll-free phone number and internet address for the state's AT program. So here's the example that is the notice of conference form. It's an example of how those notifications should be worded. So it says the IEP team will discuss whether your child requires assistive technology for FAPE. And it gives the phone number and a web address for contacting the AT program. I have to say, this is a very powerful advocacy action for people who really want to make sure that children who need assistive technology get assistive technology. Because what it says to every parent is, we're going to talk about this. If you don't know what assistive technology is, or if you don't know how it will help your child, here's some places where you can go to get information. But it prompts parents to come to the meeting with the information that their child does have a right to assistive technology. So I've never seen anything like it in any other state, but I think it can be a real advocacy tool for students who need assistive technology. Once you get to your IEP meeting in the state of Illinois, and again, I have not seen this in other states, so I think you should be proud. The question is, in your consideration of special factors, for any box checked yes, specify the special factors in the supplementary aids and accommodations section of the IEP. But for assistive technology devices and services, if you say yes, specify what AT is needed. And if you say no, specify why AT is not needed for FAPE. Again, that's a special rule in Illinois, and I think it must go quite a long way in making sure that we have a thorough and effective conversation about assistive technology during IEP meetings. In the guide, we offered some examples. There are not a lot of examples in the guide because our experience is that if you give examples, people copy them word for word. So we want to say, please do not copy examples word for word. But here are a couple ways that we might address Sarah's need for assistive technology. So if the IEP team chooses to check yes, this child does need assistive technology, you put in some words that might sound like this. Based on teacher observation data, Sarah requires specially designed devices to access instruction. And the following AT services and/or devices will be provided. And then you list what the student needs in that area of the IEP. If you say no, the important thing to say is why not? So here's an example. Sarah can complete the required instructional tasks and access the school environment using standard classroom adaptations and the accommodations and modifications that are already in place. So based on the student's present level of academic and functional performance, she does not need AT services to receive FAPE. One of the things we've seen in this checking the no box, and Amy, if you have anything to contribute about this one, I'd love your input. But one of the things we've seen is that people tend to say in the IEP section, if no is checked, well, they don't need assistive technology for FAPE because they don't need it. So we're looking for a more clear and hopefully a little bit more articulate example when the no box is checked.
Hi, Gail. This is Amy. Yes, I agree in that even just adding a little bit more detail, like the example says, is really helpful, especially if in the future a team might say, well, actually, yes, and let's talk about past and present and future. So the more information, the better.
And I think that's a really good point, that you may say no for several years, and then often, for instance, at about fourth grade level, some teams begin to decide that they do need assistive technology for reading or for writing because they aren't able to make enough progress to keep up with their non-disabled peers. So it's good to have that as a record of the conversations that you have had in the past. And it might say, Sarah doesn't need assistive technology for reading this year, but she is falling behind. I mean, there could be lots of things that you could say in that box if you check no. Another area that we really wanted to focus on again, because it's a pretty new concept for some people, and it really leads itself to some definitions that we thought were important. So what's the difference between consideration of the need for assistive technology, like the consideration that the IEP team does in special factors, the difference between consideration, evaluation, and assessment? So we wanted to review that with you again, and we have cited the specific pages in the guide that talk about those differences. So consideration, you'll see this list at the top of the slide, and it's bulleted in kind of a funny way because it really is one very long sentence that we split into four bullets, because each bullet, I think, has some important information to share with us. So consideration is the process that occurs during an IEP meeting. So that's one thing, is that it can't be a very long evaluation process. It's a conversation that occurs during an IEP meeting when an IEP team determines whether or not a student needs AT to receive FAPE, so the direct relationship between the student's goals and the assistive technology they might need. And the team documents the decision within the student's IEP, and we've already looked at that documentation requirement. And then the final part is IEP team members present all available data regarding the student in order to make that decision. So the words in italics right below those bullets also clarify that in certain situations, tools may prove beneficial to a student and are already readily available in the classroom. In that case, a teacher or a service provider might introduce that additional strategy or intervention and bring that information to a student's IEP meeting, and then bring the data that's collected regarding that student's performance while using those tools. And the team could make a decision if they have evidence and data that the assistive technology needs of this child are met in using that assistive technology. I'm not quite sure why, but on my slide set, there's a note that this citation is on page 22, but I don't see it on the screen here. So I want to just point out to you that these words in italics are on page 22 of the guide if you need that reference. But what's the difference between consideration and assessment? Whoops. Oh, wait, there's the 22. So sometimes during the course of the AT consideration process, we've already talked about, the IEP team identifies that a student may need AT, but needs to gather additional information about the AT. So that's when you don't have enough data to make a decision. When an IEP team embarks on the process of collecting this targeted information, then they have begun an AT evaluation. The findings of the AT evaluation inform the AT consideration process that takes place during an IEP meeting. So that's the page 22 citation. I actually believe both of those citations are on the same page. So that's consideration, and sometimes during a consideration discussion, a team says, we don't have enough information yet. And what we're doing right here is providing definitions that can be used in your IEP processes. So an AT assessment is a tool used to gather information on the student's performance in relation to any AT services and devices. And like all good teaching practices, this can include integration of a variety of instructional practices, review of the delivery systems, trial of different practices, and could include assistive technology. An assistive technology assessment could include ongoing assessment of student performance in relation to any AT needs. And again, that would be as a part of a regular classroom activity and could be conducted as an assessment by those instructional staff that work with the student most often and appropriate to assess the student's skills. Basically, that's where the teacher says, you know, I know there's an app in this Chromebook, or I know there's an app in this iPad that allows the text to be spoken out loud to a student. And I think this student might benefit. So those are the kinds of conversations that teachers might be having in classrooms, and they might just go ahead and try some things in the classroom. So the citation for these words is on page 23 of the guide. But let's now talk about evaluation. So evaluation is the process by which an IEP team collects information to determine a student's individual need for AT and AT services. And an evaluation is a much more formal process that does include timelines and permissions. And that's why we want to make the distinction. So if a student already has a reading goal and the teacher wants to try some text-to-speech or something like that, then that can be done as part of an assessment. But when an evaluation is needed, that kicks us into the legal processes and timelines. An AT evaluation could be conducted by members of the IEP team who have knowledge about the AT and AC services that could benefit the student, and does not have to be conducted by a specialist. But sometimes you need a specialist because the team just doesn't have enough information. So when an IEP team finds that an AT evaluation is necessary as a result of the consideration discussion and the data gathered as part of the assessment, the team should suspend the consideration of AT until the AT evaluation is complete. However, that does not negate the need to follow the IEP timelines and the assessment timelines. So it doesn't absolve the IEP team from meeting the legal requirements for doing things in a timely manner. Again, this is, yeah.
Sorry about that, just jumping in really quick. You know, if that section of the conversation is paused, we did address this last time, but just to keep in mind that trialing of devices or trialing of tools and things like that does not need to pause during that sort of evaluation period. You can still trial and work out what would be the best tool for that student, even though that consideration piece has been paused to gather more information.
Can you repeat that? So, could you say that in a different way?
Sure. So I know we've had questions about if the team is at the IEP table, the consideration piece, and they say, you know, we're going to need a full evaluation. We just don't have the information, or we don't have the staff expertise. So let's go ahead and kick off an evaluation. That means we have 60 school days once we get consent. But we were asked last time, and a couple people asked this question, said, okay, well, during that evaluation period, are we allowed to trial certain tools and devices and things, even though we haven't made any decisions? And the answer to that is yes, you may trial things during that evaluation period, even though whatever you're trialing hasn't been specifically documented in IEP. It's all part of that evaluation process. Does that make more sense?
Yes, thank you. So this also is language about evaluation that's in the guide. Should a team decide to evaluate AT tools and services as part of the evaluation domain area, they must obtain parental consent and abide by procedural timelines. So again, that obtaining parental consent really starts an entire set of timelines that need to be in place. Teams may also want to consider conducting a formal reevaluation for students to obtain substantive data for the consideration of AT tools and services. So you may be wanting to know if a student needs assistive technology, but in that process, you may find that what you really need to know is what are the characteristics of the student's reading right now? How is it different than it was 3 years ago when we did the most recent eligibility? One of the reasons I'm thrilled to have Amy here with us is that she is the expert on domains and timeline questions. And so, Amy, I'm going to leave this to you. I know we did this before, but it turns out we need to do it again.
Yeah, no problem. I know that this information can get confusing. So in the development of the FAQ document, especially, we had some really great conversations around this entire process and how different folks from different parts of the field approach the conversation. And in that conversation, we discovered that some of us were using different operational definitions of the word domain. So there's a couple different things that the word domain can refer to. So the first definition would be the domain areas. And so when we're thinking about those domain areas, those are the main areas that we evaluate students in their initial evaluation or reevaluation. So those are cognitive, academic, speech and communication, health, functional, social emotional. Those are the domain areas. Okay, so when we're talking about something, for example, like a reading goal, that's most likely going to come out of data you've collected from either the cognitive or the academic domain areas. When we say domain meeting, so domain meeting refers to when the team is physically at the table, parents or guardians included, and you're talking about what evaluations you'd like to do to collect more information in each of the domains. Or you're saying, we don't need to collect anything in the health domain. The student is healthy, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the physical act of the meeting. And typically at the end of that meeting is when you receive that signed consent from the parent or guardian to evaluate, and you embark on the evaluation journey. So when we talk about opening a domain, that means that we as a team, we really would like more information. We're speaking in terms of AT. We need more information on how this student can use AT to access writing, some writing supports. And maybe what you'll do is, quote, open up the reading or the academic domain and say, we're going to do some evaluation, like an AT evaluation, under the academic domain to inform if this student can use some AT to help with their writing goals. So that domain is open. That means we've gotten consent, we're evaluating, and that kicks off the evaluation process, which consent for evaluation needs to be received from a parent or guardian, typically through that domain meeting process. Although sometimes, especially now, we've been doing a lot of meetings and stuff over the phone or communicating via email. Basically, the timeline gets kicked off when you, again, get that consent from the parent. Yep, go ahead, evaluate, collect the data. It is a 60 school day timeline, so it's not 60 calendar days, it is 60 school days. And like I said, you are able to trial any AT devices or tools during that evaluation process. So the student can still get access to AT even though we're in that evaluation period. And that's a little bit different because if you have an initial evaluation for speech services, for example, the student is not going to receive speech services until they've been found eligible for it. But it's a little different for AT because AT is not a related service necessarily. It doesn't have its own domain, but we do want students to be able to have access to some of those tools while we're collecting the data. So, okay, you can move on, Gail.
Okay. There.
Okay. So this is a quick snapshot of just that timeline, the IEP development timeline. And this is in our guide, our parents' guide to special education, when the link is in the PowerPoint. So basically it's just a flow chart just to show the steps that are followed for the IEP process. If there's an evaluation involved, it usually involves a referral for an evaluation. Either that's the initial evaluation, the 3-year, or there's a brand new presenting issue that we need to get consent to evaluate for. You then have that domain meeting, get the consent. You have 60 school days to complete the evaluation. Some schools or districts or what have you complete that in less than 60 days, and that's fine. As soon as that's done, then you have that eligibility determination meeting. You develop the IEP. Parent gives consent for those services, and that IEP is implemented. Okay, so again, when you're opening a domain, you are sort of kicking open a door to get consent for more information. And this is from an example of an IEP document on the ISBE webpage of what it looks like when you're filling out that domain paperwork. So if, for example, you're in the communication status domain area, because this student is a student who is nonverbal, this student has speech supports, this is going to be relevant for them. And even if at this meeting you decide you do not need any more information, it's still relevant to this student. So you click yes. Then you would enter in the existing information. Here's what we know. Do you need additional data? Yes, we want more information because XYZ. This is the question we're trying to answer, is to answer this information about AT. And then the last piece is where you're going to put, we're going to do an assistive technology evaluation as the source from which the data will come. I see a couple of questions that have popped up in the chat that I can address really, really quick. So one of the questions is about AT being a related service, and AT is not a related service, considered a related service, as in a related service that's related to a direct goal. As far as I know, usually the AT services are attached to some other goal area. And there was another question that we might have to come back to regarding the domain itself, basically asking, do you need to document the consideration of AT, or is it only required to document during the IEP meeting? Though that section is just included in that IEP. You would not change an IEP during a domain meeting. You're correct. So if you're just talking about AT for the first time at a domain meeting, then you're golden. You're good to go. You've already opened that door. You're starting the conversation. What happens is sometimes that it happens backwards, where you're at an IEP meeting and the team is saying, we want to try some AT, and that's where you're going to use that AT considerations. But if you're just starting the journey, you're opening that domain up, you would not need to make any changes to the IEP at that time. I think that was my last slide in this area, Gail.
I think it was. So let me move on to the next section. And again, I will thank you for those of you who typed your questions in the question box. We will take more as we move forward. What we decided to do for today was to give you some of the scenarios that some of the AT specialists we have been working with provided to us, and talk about how a team might address those particular scenarios. So you can see this one is about Devin's team. Devin's a middle school student eligible for special education services under specific learning disability. He's reading independently at a 2nd grade level, so that's pretty far behind his middle school placement, but he's easily getting the curricular discussions. If he's hearing it auditorily, he's able to participate at grade level. Devin's case manager went to a training on AT tools to support students in the area of reading, and she's worked with the AT specialist in the past for other students. She thinks Devin would benefit from a text-to-speech application that would read aloud curricular tests, and she's familiar with 2 such applications. So what do we know? We know that Devin already has reading goals, and he has that kind of concern and his reading has been evaluated. The question is, what are the next steps for the team? Does the team need to move forward with an assessment or an evaluation? Are additional personnel needed to support this student and this evaluation? What I wanted to do first, and we're going to do this with every example, is refer you to the pages in the guide where this kind of a question might be addressed, at least to the level of detail that we're able to address it from a state level perspective. So you can see that reviewing current information about the student, developing goals and objectives. And then the final question here, I think, is the pertinent one for this example of what does this team do next? Does the team have the knowledge and skills necessary to make this decision? So in order to discuss that, these are some of the kinds of things that the team might have to do as they begin to think about Devin's IEP and his need for assistive technology. So first question, what are his current reading goals, accommodations, and specially designed instruction? What has the academic domain revealed about Devin's performance? And what did Devin and his parents and his teachers think about trying text-to-speech? So that's a whole nother question. What data do we have about Devin? Then what do the rest of the team members feel about trying this idea that the teacher is suggesting? Does the teacher have enough knowledge to actually do this trial? And we said that we thought she did. And then the important question, are additional personnel needed to support the assessment and or an evaluation? What text-to-speech applications are already available, and which textbook or curricular activity would lend itself to a good trial of text-to-speech, and how long would that trial last? So lots of discussion questions about Devin's performance that all lend themselves to the decision about whether the team has enough information and has the skills and resources they need in order to proceed with a in-classroom assessment kind of activity, or whether they really do need to get permission, start a formal assessment process for this particular student. So my friend Joy Zavala always says the answer to most assistive technology questions is it depends. And again, this is a case where it depends is probably the answer to the question, what are the next steps for this team? Amy, again, chime in anytime if you have anything to add or concerns about what we're saying here.
Sure thing. You're doing great.
All right, great. So here's another example. Another example from some HE specialists who helped us develop these examples. Sarah's an elementary age student who's eligible for special education services under autism and speech and language impairment. She currently uses a NovaChat with WordPower, that's an augmentative communication device, to express messages. At her annual review, her mom shares that she doesn't feel like the device is meeting Sarah's expressive language needs, and she has pursued a private assistive technology evaluation, and a different device was recommended. So the question here is, what are the next steps for this team? Does the team need to move forward with an assessment or evaluation, or are additional personnel needed to support the assessment? One of the things we wanted to point out to you that is this citation that is in the guide that says that you have to consider the information that the parents brought, but also consider any other information that you have. You're not obligated to agree with the evaluation the parent has brought, but that there are other things that you can do in order to continue this as a conversation rather than a conflict situation. So for next steps, what are Sarah's current expressive language goals? Is there assessment data that describes how the Nova Chat is working? Does the school have data? Because the mom's saying she doesn't feel like it's useful. Is there performance data about Sarah's use of the Nova Chat? Does the team have the knowledge and skills? Again, was there a trial period with the device recommended by the outside evaluator? And if so, in what environments? Are additional personnel needed to support the evaluation? So once again, it depends on the answers that the IEP team may have to some of these questions. But one of the things that I always like to recommend is that when a parent brings an outside evaluation like this, the team really, in my opinion, should at least do some kind of a trial in the educational setting of that device that was recommended by the outside evaluators so that they can compare it to the things that Sarah's using already. I can see that we're about out of time. Every time we pull one of these webinars together, it's a little hard to know how long it's going to take. So there are 2 more examples in this PowerPoint that I will leave you to review on your own because we are out of time. Mateo, the question is, can the team explore AT for Mateo even though he doesn't have an IEP? So this would be a 504 kind of question. And then in Paola's team, how can the middle school team document her use as she makes a transition? And I wanted to point out to you that there is a chapter in the guide on transition planning for students who use AT. I wanted to call your attention before we close to the appendices. In the appendices, there are the quality indicators for assistive technology from the Quiet Consortium, and also quality indicators for assistive technology for students who have Section 504 plans, do not necessarily need specially designed instruction, but do have a disability. And there are also some team process forms that I think you might find very valuable and useful in terms of figuring out some of these approaches to the conversations that we have said in these final examples. The team will need to have a discussion before they can make that specific determination of assessment or consideration or evaluation. So thank you again for joining us today. Any questions or concerns that you have, please do type them into the questions box and we'd be happy to address your questions at a later date. And this is how you find us. So thanks again for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure working with Illinois on this project.
Thank you very much, Gail. This is Amy. Just want to thank everybody for bearing with us and being with us for all these webinars and whatnot. And again, if you have any questions about Illinois statutes or regulations or what have you, please do feel free to email me. I did really quick see a quick question: should AT minutes be added to related service page? If you guys check out the IDEA Assistive Technology Service definition, it does not include direct services from an assistive technology person. So I do not believe that there is space on the IEP for AT as a direct service, although it could be put under things like support for personnel, under part of the services that will be received under speech and language. So just be aware of that and do feel free to reach out if you have any more questions. So thank you to Gail and thank you so much to Infinitec.
Thank you so much, ladies. And we had just to clarify for myself, we did have a couple additional questions pop in. Were those things you wanted me to email you after the webinar and that you would address at that point in time?
That would be fantastic.
Okay, I will go that route. So those folks who have questions at address, I will share those with Gail and Amy, and we'll include some kind of follow-up so we can get that information to you. And if anyone else has any additional things or questions they would like to post, I will do that same format. So again, Gail and Amy, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and expertise through this whole process. It's been fabulous having you here, especially for these follow-up sessions that people get some of those additional details addressed. So thank all of you for attending. This will conclude the webinar, and I hope that everyone has a fantastic night. Thanks again, Gail and Amy.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for joining us.